It's a revolution against an elite class that has become fundamentally out of touch with a large number of voters, particularly on issues like mass immigration, border security, the imposition of woke ideology, political correctness, and also an economic model that hasn't always worked for the working class in Western societies. It's a
treat to host this week's guest. We've actually tried to do this a few times, and schedules can be a little bit challenging because this guest, I think, is one of the greatest guys on the planet, certainly one of the greatest people in the United Kingdom. You know that I'm an Anglophile, even with all of the cultural and political challenges facing Great Britain. You will love, if you have not already met, our guest this week, Dr. Matt Goodwin. He's the senior advisor at the Legatum Institute, a very close institutional friend of Heritage, honorary professor of politics at the University of Kent. And if you're familiar with Substack, I think he's got the best Substack in the world. I can't do any better than that, my British friend. Dr. Matt Goodwin, thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for the very kind introduction, and I'll be sending the money immediately after this podcast for the kind words.
Well, you know, as a Southerner in the United States, I take great pleasure in embarrassing my British friends with those really warm and long introductions, which I know all of you hate. So maybe I owe you the beer the next time we're together. But look, Matt, all joviality and kidding aside, it really is a pleasure to have you on this show. You were at Heritage some weeks ago, gave a wonderful address and speech. We will link to that in the show notes because I am convinced that every member of the audience of this show, if they're not already familiar with you, will really appreciate the precision of your thinking, in particular as it relates to the diagnosis of the West generally. You're a Brit, you focus on British politics, but you also have a lot of great analysis about what's going on in the United States and elsewhere. So we're going to cover the rise of populism. We're going to cover what's going on in your country, what you think is going on in ours. We're going to have a great time the next half hour. But just from the top, I think our folks in this audience would be most interested starting with they're trying to make sense of the rise of populism, especially if they are conservatives. And sometimes some media outlets on your side of the Atlantic and ours try to drive this wedge between populism and conservatism, suggesting that somehow they're mutually exclusive. Just give us your general thoughts, whether about that specific aspect of it, but even more importantly, what you think is going on politically.
And firstly, thank you for the invitation to be on the show, and thank you to Heritage for some wonderful hospitality when I was in Washington a few weeks ago. It really was a great talk, and if you were there and you're watching this show, then I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I think if you look across Western democracies today, what we're seeing essentially is a continuation of a political counter-revolution that's been coming for really 30 or 40 years, and it's a revolution against an elite class that has become fundamentally out of touch with a large number of voters, particularly on issues like mass immigration, border security, the imposition of woke ideology, political correctness, and also an economic model that hasn't always worked for the working class in Western societies. And if you look where I am in Westminster, I'm speaking to you from Westminster in the UK. Here too, we're seeing many of the same things that America is seeing, France and Italy are seeing, where millions of voters are really rebelling against the liberal establishment, the status quo. It sounds perverse to say that, given that we've just elected a Labour government with a big majority. But really the story there was the rise of none of the above politics. We had lots of apathy, lots of voters staying at home, lots of voters moving to Nigel Farage, who your viewers will know is an ally of Donald Trump, because they feel that nobody in Westminster really has control over immigration. Nobody has control over the borders. They're very uncomfortable with what children are being taught around sex, gender, and also, unfortunately, critical race theory, which is, again, something you're very familiar with in the US, but only now it's beginning to percolate into our education system. And if you look at France, Italy, Hungary, Austria, I think, really, Kevin, it's the same story. Lots of voters, often working class, not always, often from the small towns, rural areas, not always, often united by culturally conservative values, who are essentially saying, look, the radicalization of the elite class, which is what's really been happening here, the elite class is radicalized, is no longer serving the interests of ordinary voters, and is certainly no longer representing or even respecting their values within the political community. And that's why, I've been looking at populism, or you might call it maybe ultra-conservatism, or national conservatism, whatever your favorite term. I think fundamentally this is something that has been coming for 30 or 40 years. It's been getting stronger. It might not win all elections, but over time it's been getting stronger and stronger because voters do not essentially feel safe in their own countries anymore. And that's really my kind of 2-minute diagnosis as to what's happening. There's a lot to unpack, particularly in terms of what's happening here in Europe. But this is really, I think, about that enormous gulf between the values of the people who are running our societies and the values of the people who are having to live with the consequences of the decisions that are being made.
The gulf between the elites, and it now doesn't matter which political party the elites belong to, as evidenced by the most recent conservative, capital C conservative prime ministership in your country, and working class people, I don't think has ever been wider, at least in my lifetime, in half a century, both in the UK and in the United States. And it seems to me, just to home in on your conservative party's issues, it's challenges, to say the least, before we get on to the job performance of your new prime minister, Keir Starmer, that it could go either way. It could be that the Conservative Party, the oldest conservative political institution in the West, for sure, perhaps the world, may be able to reformulate itself, although it seems as if it does so, it's going to have to reformulate itself with a much warmer embrace of populism. Or it may, and correct me certainly if I'm wrong, it may not be able to do that. And the timeline for that is not 5 or 10 years from now. It's like 5 or 10 weeks. There are some really important decisions coming up by rank and file conservatives in the UK. I know that our American audience is keenly interested in that.
Yeah. Well, I think, essentially you've hit the nail on the head. Look, the historic power of the British Conservative Party is the power of renewal. That is why it is one of the most successful political parties in the history of democracy. You go back and you think about, some of the famous conservative leaders in British politics, the likes of Disraeli, Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, and more recently, people like David Cameron, Boris Johnson. They've all brought something a little bit different to the table. And it's that power of reinvention that has given the Conservative Party, this durability. Where I think we are today, and why I think Americans will be particularly interested in this, my reading is this. We've had this global political realignment that 2016 really gave expression to. Trump was one of the only people really that recognized it. I think the Brexit campaign here in the UK recognized it. And it was an understanding that the Conservative coalition had to fundamentally change. And it was also an understanding that the supply side of that realignment, what you say to voters, had to change, right? All realignments are about demand and supply. I think Trump recognized that. I think Nigel Farage recognized that. I think the Brexit campaign, people like Boris Johnson for a while recognized that. And then essentially what happened, I think, is the American conservative movement remained very focused on that realignment. It stayed aligned to those new voters, which is why I think, today Donald Trump is still, in competition for the White House. The British Conservatives, on the other hand, they won over that realignment, most noticeably in 2019 when Boris Johnson won this very big 80-seat majority. But they then did the opposite of what those new voters really wanted to see. So Boris Johnson promised lower migration. He put it on steroids. Those voters were promised control over their borders. The Conservatives lost control of the borders. Those voters wanted a meaningful Brexit. The Conservatives struggled to really understand the scale of divergence from the European Union that those voters wanted. The Conservatives promised them that the left behind regions, the flyover country, would be leveled up, that working class districts would be given a helping hand, and then they failed to deliver on that policy as well. So the supply side of the realignment completely collapsed. And, yes, Boris Johnson got unlucky with things like the war in Ukraine, the COVID pandemic. But what I would argue is that here, the Conservative Parliamentary Party, the political class in Westminster, was actually, when it comes to values around the family, immigration, borders, security, woke ideology, Conservative MPs were closer to their Labour colleagues than they were to their new voters. And that really opened up this enormous gap in the market where Nigel Farage, as we saw at our most recent election, actually came back with his best performance ever. He won a handful of seats in the House of Commons. He won 4 million votes. And he basically, did the sort of Trump playbook. He came in and he said, look, a bit like Trump used to say about the old conservatives around, Mitt Romney and so on. He said, look, these guys aren't in touch anymore. We need something new. We need to take these concerns seriously. And so my read, Kevin, is, British conservatism, in terms of this philosophical debate over what is conservatism, I think it is 5 to 7 years behind where you are. And I think, watching this presidential election closely, I think many British commentators find it so fascinating because, we're not hearing the arguments that J.D. Vance is making, right? We're not hearing conservatives here say, you know what, actually, I don't think globalization got everything right. We're not hearing the tough talk on we're going to do whatever it takes to restore border security. We're certainly not hearing the tough talk on woke ideology. Most British conservatives won't go near that. They think it's a very sort of a culture wars debate. But I would suggest, Kevin, when you're talking about the rights of children, the rights of women, when you're talking about your national history, when you're talking about your national culture, you can't simply accept the language that this is culture wars, right? Those are the very foundations of Western liberal societies. Now, if conservatives are accepting that language, they're accepting the language of their enemies. And I think that's where we have so much to learn, actually, from American politics. So for me, this is a story about two realignments. One that is still going very well, I think, in America. At least it's keeping Republicans competitive. And one that has gone absolutely terribly in the UK, which has almost finished off the British Conservative Party.
And, on that point, I'll underscore it, although it may seem counterintuitive at first, just fast forwarding from where we are here in the late summer 2024, if, God forbid, conservatives in the United States don't win the presidential election this year, there is, of course, in addition to the terrible policies that will be instituted by the other side, something you're living through right now with your prime minister. We'll come back to him in a minute. But there's going to be a philosophical just cataclysm on the political right in the United States. And what is a now small minority of conservatives, not forsaking them certainly as people, not even as potential allies, but a small minority of them we do have a disagreement with. And what they're going to claim is that the path back to conservative ascendancy in the United States is to forsake the so-called cultural issues, including fighting DEI, including fighting transgender ideology. And not only is that political suicide, because as a movement conservative myself, I can tell you that's what people care about. It's also a righteous cause. It's one of those things that reminds me of conversations I've had over the last few years when I visit the UK about once a quarter, including with now, unfortunately, a former member of your parliament, Miriam Cates, who I think was a visionary on this issue and others. It seems to me, to underscore your point, Matt, that the path in our respective countries for conservatives is the same, even if the timeline is 5 or 7 years off. And that is regardless of the consequences of the presidential election for us this fall, and regardless of the result of the leadership elections in the Conservative Party in your country this fall, there has to be a working class coalition in both of those parties that is willing to continue to confront DEI, willing to continue to confront the transgender ideology, not just because those are the right causes, but also because there isn't a political future if you don't include those two facets.
Well, I mean, I'll give you a head start on that. We've already got evidence as to what a left-wing government would really do on a lot of those issues. Obviously, you've been living through the Biden administration. My outside reading of America is that Kamala Harris would probably be even more radical than Joe Biden. But let's see if I'm right, if and when that were to happen. But here in the UK with a Labour government, well, look, we've only had a government for 2 months, and what can we already see? Taxes are going up. Power is being redistributed to unelected government agencies, what we'd call quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organizations. We call them quangos, basically experts who are not elected by the people. We have no serious plan for illegal migration. The only deterrent we had on that has already been removed by the new Labour government. We've now got CRT going into the schools, so children in our schools are going to be taught about whiteness and white privilege. We've had free speech legislation cancelled for the universities, which was the first law, something I helped design and deliver, was the first law that would actually ensure that universities could be fined if they sacked conservatives and gender critical scholars because they weren't reforming themselves. I was very reluctant to bring in the state to do that, but universities were not reforming themselves. We've got prisoners being released early, which is another thing that's happened only the last couple of weeks. So after only serving 40% of their sentences. And Keir Starmer, our new Labour Prime Minister, you might have seen we had immigration protests across the country. We had some large-scale rioting, which 2/3 of all voters said was because of recent immigration policy. Well, Keir Starmer just essentially denounced all of those people as being far-right thugs, and he wasn't really interested at all in looking at the underlying reasons as to why people feel fed up and frustrated. And as if all of that wasn't enough, we've also got new legislation for social media, which is basically now going to create a new, very chilling term, which is legal but harmful speech. So if you say something that is entirely legal but is emotionally harmful for other people in society, you can essentially be given a criminal record for that. So a very Orwellian, authoritarian turn in what is the home of Magna Carta and the home of individual liberty. So look, we knew this was coming, and it is fundamentally the weakness of the British Conservatives that has allowed this to happen because they completely lost sight with who was voting for them. I think a new generation of MPs and former MPs like Miriam Cates, among others, have good ideas, but they now are at a crossroads, Kevin. They have to decide now whether they are going to stick with the British Conservative Party or whether they are going to use the rival reform movement under Nigel Farage to try and create something that is a bit more appealing and resonant to voters, which is why I would say that the current leadership election that is taking place, as you and I are talking over the next few weeks, the Conservatives are going to try and find a new leader. This is, I would suggest, the most important leadership election in the contemporary history of the Conservative Party, because if they get this wrong, if they choose the wrong leader who veers them back off into what they would call the centre, even though it's usually a centre ground for a 20% liberal progressive minority in the media and the cultural institutions, they will create the biggest opening for Nigel Farage and the Reform Party that this country has seen really on record. So this is an enormously consequential decision that the Conservatives are currently making. And it will ultimately, in one way or another, it will define the future of not just the Conservative Party, but it will define the future of British politics.
As a direct follow-up to that point, what does your gut tell you about how that election will go? Not necessarily looking for specific names, although that's fine, really more about the ideological, the philosophical points of emphasis once that leader is chosen and what he or she will be saying, how they will be framing what's at stake, because it couldn't be clearer, that is, what's at stake couldn't be clearer based on the policies of Keir Starmer.
So I think that's a great question, especially given the experience that you guys have had in the US in watching the redefinition of conservatism. Look, for me, looking at this philosophical debate, and someone who influenced me a lot was Roger Scruton, who was a sort of a conservative philosopher here in the UK. And I was in Hungary recently at the Roger Scruton Cafe, where they celebrate conservatives in Hungary. They actually rename cafes after them, whereas in the UK, some viewers might know that, unfortunately, Roger Scruton was thrown under the bus, is what we would say here, by his fellow Conservatives. He was effectively cancelled in public life, and the Conservatives weren't sure whether they should rush to defend one of their own. But I've been rereading Scruton a lot recently while watching this leadership election campaign, and I think it kind of takes me to what I would consider to be the really big questions in this contest. So I would be asking them, what is your position on mass immigration, number one? Because if you're not saying that we should reduce mass immigration in this country. Our net migration level now is 700,000 a year, meaning 700,000 more people coming in than leaving. The numbers are small compared to America, but remember, we're a small country. What is your policy on mass immigration? Because if you're not saying we should reduce it to below 100,000, we should have an immediate freeze on all non-essential migration, I'm not really going to be interested. Number two, what is your strategy for stopping the illegal migration invasion of the country? Are you going to seriously commit to leaving something called the European Convention on Human Rights, which would allow us to control our own borders and would allow us to stop the boats coming across from France? Will you commit to that? Number three, what are you interested in when it comes to woke ideology? Are you committed to rooting this stuff out from all public institutions, the civil service, the schools, the universities? Number four, what do you think about the state? Are you willing to use the state, if necessary, to intervene in order to level the playing field when it comes to these cultural questions? Or are you simply saying that actually we're going to roll back the state, that's it, and we're going to leave institutions to do what they want to do? And lastly, on the economy, this is my personal view, are you seriously committed to embedding a principle of national preference into our economy, what Americans might call patriotic protectionism? That's not anything to do with redistribution, but it's to say, are you open to ensuring that this economy, including our housing market, first and foremost works for British people, British workers, and British families? Because if you're not interested in saying that, if you're not interested in pushing back against global corporates that basically want mass migration in order to keep profits high and costs low, or you're not pushing back against Russian oligarchs who own a quarter of London and we're in the midst of a serious housing crisis, then I've got an issue with you as a conservative, because that's not a very conservative thing to do. You're here to preserve and promote the national community. Those are the questions I'd be asking them, Kevin. And so far, the field, in my mind, is fairly weak. I think Robert Jenrick is probably the only person making the right noises around the migration questions. He's somebody who, interestingly, was working inside the state. And it was that experience. He was a liberal, like a liberal conservative. But the story is, he was so appalled by what he saw within the government departments, that he was basically radicalized by the experience of seeing how this actually works behind the scenes. Now, a lot of conservatives are saying, well, let's just wait and see. We're not entirely convinced whether, he's giving us the genuine story. But so far, he seems to be the person on the right of the Conservative Party who is rallying support. If, on the other hand, the Conservatives go for somebody like Tom Tugendhat, who's a kind of very liberal conservative, or a Mel Stride character, again, very liberal conservative, then I think, this is not an exaggeration. I mean, this could really be lights out for the Conservatives. This could really be, they're on life support now, don't forget. They're on 121 seats. And if they get this wrong, and Nigel Farage starts powering ahead, we could be in a Canada 1993 situation where suddenly the Conservative Party is eclipsed by a more conservative, with a capital C, Conservative Party. And I think that's what makes this also fascinating.
Well, it is, and it's vital not just for your country and countrymen, but particularly for us in the United States and the entire world. The future of Anglo-American conservatism is vital for the future of freedom, for the future of the nation state, and the proper pride and patriotism in the nation state, as we have respectively talked about at the same conferences over the last few years. On that point, what's the future of Brexit? I mean, Keir Starmer is already making moves that seem to be designed to explicitly undermine it.
Well, in brief, don't forget Keir Starmer is the guy who not only told us to elect Jeremy Corbyn, a radical socialist, as the prime minister of our country. In fact, he told us to do that twice in 2017 and 2019. But he also campaigned aggressively for a second referendum on Brexit, so that the voters could essentially make the right decision, because in his mind, they made the wrong decision. Keir Starmer is somebody who, like many people on the left, basically view anything they disagree with as populism and inconvenient misinformation. That essentially is the Starmer playbook. So when it comes to Brexit, what he said is he's looking for a reset moment. He wants closer economic ties with the EU. He's already said today, as I'm talking to you at the end of August, 2024 that he's open to a free movement scheme allowing Europeans under the age of 30 to come and work and live in the UK. Now, look, ordinarily, Kevin, I think if we weren't in the era of mass immigration, now I've said in public, I think this is an extreme policy of mass immigration. It only represents the interests of 10% of the country. And if you're that out of touch, I think it is an extreme policy. If we were in a normal era, running net migration at 50,000 a year, and it was high skill and it was contributing to the economy, then instinctively, I think many people would feel quite comfortable about having a youth exchange scheme with our European neighbors, because fundamentally, we share a lot of values. We share history, we share culture. It's Western civilization. I think we'd be up for trying to support that. The problem now is Keir Starmer is saying, well, let's have another liberalization of the migration scheme on top of having had about 4 million people come into the UK over the last 3 or 4 years. So we've had more migration over the last 5 years than we've had basically between 1066 and the beginning of the 21st century. I mean, it's correct. 4% of our population arrived in the last 2 years. So the immigration explosion that we're all living through, which is trickling into housing, public services, culture, security, has been something this country has never seen before. So Starmer is now adding on top of that this idea, well, let's have more migration from Europe, because instinctively Labour politicians would much rather our future be tied to Europe than the US. And I think there are many people in Westminster saying, actually, look, the future of Brexit Britain is not to lock ourselves in with a protectionist, big state, sluggish, lazy, divided, culturally incoherent European Union. And that's what I think it is. It's divided between East and West over culture. It's divided between North and South over the economy. I don't think the European Union will be a dynamic, expanding, innovative bloc in the future. It's declining as a share of the world economy. I would much rather we say, look, we've diverged from the EU. Now let's do everything we can with that divergence. Let's explore a free trade agreement with America. Let's get closer to Australia. Let's get closer to some parts of Asia, not so much China. But let's actually reposition ourselves here so we can be nimble, we can be flexible. You know, we're not the Great Britain of the days of, Winston Churchill. Unfortunately, we're a different power. But let's use that power in a much more effective, clever way. Labour don't view us that way fundamentally. They view us as being a sort of ally of the European Union. And were it up to them, and of course, if they win another election, this may well happen, they will be looking to push us back in some form or other into the single market and customs union.
Hence the importance of what's happening in the near term about the future of your Conservative Party. Well, I would sit and talk with you for hours. We'll do that soon enough on your side of the pond. But I'll ask you one more question as we move toward wrapping up. And that is, what advice would you have for this mostly American audience about what they should be doing? Often, in other words, Matt, the context for that question is this. Often I hear from audience members, Kevin, give us a homework assignment, give us next steps, practical advice to the extent that you can, whether it be something political or, my big passion, even beyond policy and politics, is institution building. If in fact the United Kingdom is 5 to 7 years a little ahead in terms of what's going on regarding the reformulation of conservatism, you've got some advice to share with us, I know.
I think it's a great question. Look, the reason I'm an optimist ultimately is we are seeing lots of new things being created and built, and there's a lot of synergy, there's a lot of energy at the moment. As I say, I was in Hungary recently, and I was talking with Christopher Rufo from the US, who gave a talk about how he was taking on some of the universities in the US, and then I came back to the UK, and it was Eric Kaufman who was setting up a new university at Buckingham, a new research centre at Buckingham, which of course was Margaret Thatcher's university that she supported. And he's creating a heterodox centre for social science. And, he's quite close to what's happening at Austin, where you have people like Neil Ferguson and others in the US, and Ralston College. And again, Jordan Peterson setting up his academy. I think there is a lot of energy at the moment that's going on and being invested in new things. But I think where there needs to be a little bit of work is really bringing the key players together to ensure that what is happening is firstly not duplicating what's already out there, but is also happening in a very efficient way. I think there's a generational aspect to that too, Kevin. I think if you look, if I was being a constructive, critical friend of some people in the UK, I would say we're still too dependent on an older generation of politicians, and there are lots of millennials and Zoomers who really want to get involved in the fight. They want to be brought forward in political parties and political movements. I think there's a real energy to get involved. I think Americans can also be giving us lots of lessons actually about what has worked and what hasn't. You've gone through the philosophical tussle in the Republican movement, as far as I can see. You might be right. You might be on the verge of another one. Let's see what happens. But it looks like you've gone through the philosophical tussle that we're about to go through. So I think British Conservatives would like to learn about that. So, what has worked in places like Florida and Texas and elsewhere? What does it mean to take back parts of the state or to reform parts of the state? How can we learn about things that I know Heritage has worked on around, well, it's not enough actually to win an election. You also need to completely rewire the system. Well, how do you do that? And that is where British conservatism, I think, is weak. I don't think British conservatives are very adept at playing the long game, at saying, okay, well, you've got power, what are you going to do with it? And the Labour Party, historically, from Blair onwards, really has been much better at using power. We can see that with the Starmer government now. When they get power, they rewire the whole system. Conservatives here, less good at that. So I would say to viewers, if you've got lessons and things that you think have worked, then share them with us, interested to know, and engage with the institutional ecosystem that's emerging.
Well, as has been the case for a very long time, for that matter, the entire history of our country, our two countries are joined at the hip. That alliance, that friendship is unique in the history of the world. And that also happens on the micro level, if you will. Our friendship with you, from all of us at Heritage, Dr. Matt Goodwin, is profound. It's one that we treasure. Thanks for your time amid your busy schedule. We look forward to having you back here. And perhaps the next time we have this conversation will be on your side of the Atlantic.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you to everyone at Heritage again for a wonderful visit, and thank you to the viewers for tuning in.
Well, to those of you in the audience, thanks for joining this episode of The Kevin Roberts Show. I told you would like Dr. Matt Goodwin. You can find him at Substack, on X, on YouTube. He is a brilliant and cheerful fellow. Give him a follow. And in the meantime, keep your chin up. We are winning. Take care.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 10 million supporters of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, Tim Kennedy, and Joseph Fonspakowski. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.